Good morning. It's good to be with all of you and good to be back with all of you. Just a note, last weekend I was down at Brandon Springs at the site of our confirmation retreat, being trained to lead kids and people over their challenge course, something we're going to do in about right after Easter at our confirmation retreat. They decided it was kind of a choice in here at the office this last month or so, is that one of us had to go down and get trained to do the challenge course, and it was either the guy who had the bum arm or the guy who had the bum leg. So you figure out who won that discussion. And then Wednesday night, I was at Good Shepherd preaching for Pastor Wildauer and brought them greetings from you. So it was good to be there and good to be last weekend, but good to be back with you. I ask you if you would please grab a Bible and turn it to Genesis chapter 12. We're going to start there. It should be right at the first part of the book, page 7 or 8, somewhere in there, I think. And as you're getting there, you can kind of multitask, and because it started to take place about 3-4 years ago. Betty and I were able to go to New York State. And when we were in New York State, we visited Betty's cousin, and she took us into New York City one day. And when we were in New York City, we went to the Metropolitan Museum of Fine Art. It's called the Met. You see it in movies and stuff. The Metropolitan Museum of Fine Art is one of the best art museums in the world. And we're walking around and we're looking at the various paintings in here, and we get to one particular room and we walk into this room. Now, this room is about the size of our gymnasium down in the activities building. I'll give you a grasp of size. Walk into this room, and it's filled with pictures by Claude Monet. Now, if you don't know Claude Monet, go home and Google it. Artists can tell you Claude Monet is one of the best, right, Vicki? One of the best impressionists, one of the best artists ever. And this room was full of his paintings. And it literally just takes your breath away. It just throws you for a loop, takes your breath away. And after I kind of got my breath back and thinking back after being in here, my brain's running, and I'm thinking, this is incredible. What Monet was able to do with this paint is spectacular. You know, I have trouble doing stick figures with my finger, in paint, right? But he takes ordinary paint and does something spectacular. That's really what this story is about this morning. It's about taking the ordinary and doing something spectacular with it. It's God taking the ordinary things and doing something spectacular with it. Which brings us to Genesis chapter 12, because in Genesis chapter 12, the beginning of that chapter, there's a guy by the name of Abram. Now, I'll pause here a second and just give you a clue in here. The first part of Genesis, he's called Abram. The last part of Genesis, he's called Abraham. It's the same guy. And as I go through this sermon, I'm going to use both names, but it's referring to the same guy. So don't get confused with the names. With me? Okay? I'm just warning you how my brain's thinking. But you've got this guy by the name of Abraham. And Abraham is a pretty much ordinary guy. He lives in a place called Ur. It's on the Euphrates River. And he's sitting there, and best we can determine, he's kind of an ordinary guy. He's probably well off. He's got servants and probably got some cattle and stuff, and has the esteem and the respect of the people around him going in here. And one day comes in Yahweh, the Lord. God comes to Abraham, and he tells him this. This is where we're going to get into your Bible, Genesis 12. Just follow along with me from verse 1. He comes to Abraham, and he says this. Now, the Lord, or Yahweh, now Yahweh said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I bless those who bless you, and in him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So in other words, simply this. God comes to Abraham and says, Abraham, we're going to do three things here. One, you're going to have a great family. You don't have any kids now, but you're going to have a son. You're going to have a great family. I'm going to give you a great family. Huge. Second thing is I'm going to bless all nations through you. Everybody on earth is going to be blessed through you. And the third promise is I'm going to give you this land. But what I want you to do is I want you to just start walking, and I'll show you where you're supposed to go when you get there. Now, the crazy thing and the strange thing about this story is that Abraham actually does it, and he starts walking. And he ends up in a place called the Holy Land. He ends up in Palestine, Israel, modern-day Israel. And he's that land, and he's just living there. He doesn't own it. He's just kind of transient and walking around from place to place and finding a spot to settle in here. And Abraham waits. He's got this promise of God in Genesis 12, and he waits for 25 years. Yeah. We who today think that microwaves are slow. So the idea of waiting for God to answer, give us an answer or give us a word or give us something tomorrow is foreign. Think about it a second. Abraham had to wait 25 years waiting for God to do something. And then after 25 years, Yahweh comes back to Abraham. That's Genesis 15. So flip just flip the page. Go to Genesis 15. Right? And God comes back to Abraham in Genesis 15, and he comes back and he says, you know those promises that I gave you? I'm going to do them. Abraham is probably sitting there thinking, great. Do we have a time schedule here, God? I'm not getting any younger. And he sits there, and God says, yeah, I'm going to do these things, right? Remember, I'm going to give you a son, and through that son there's going to be a great nation. All the nations of the earth are going to be blessed, and I'm going to give you this land. Abraham's going, yeah, right, sure. And God sits there and says, okay, just so you know that I mean business here, we're going to make a contract. In the Bible, it's called a covenant. God says we're going to make a contract. Now today, right? Today, if we say contract, make a contract, what you're thinking of is you're thinking of lawyers and judges and notary publics and paperwork. We think those kinds of things making a contract. But that's not how they made contracts in Abraham's day. They did it differently. And the way they did it was this way. All right? This is where Genesis chapter 15, start at verse 17 with me. And it says, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. On that day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abram. So in other words, simply this. Where they'd make a covenant in here in those days is they would sit and they'd come to the agreement on what they were going to do, and everybody side was going to do. They would cut a bull in two and then walk between it. Now, it sounds gross and it sounds weird to us. That was an everyday, that's an ordinary thing in Abraham's day. That's an ordinary occurrence in Abraham's day. It's just the way it was done. So God uses this ordinary occurrence in Abraham's day. But notice here in this story, who passes through? It's not both of them. It's the smoking firepot and the flaming torch. Simply this. God's the one making the promise. God's the one who's doing making the contract. God's the one who's sitting there saying, this is what I'm going to do. He sits there and he says to Abraham, Abraham, this is what I'm going to do. I know you're going to make a mess of your life. Your life has been a mess so far, and it's only going to get worse in life in here. But this is what I'm going to do. This is not about you. This is about me. It's not about how you're supposed to please God. It's about what I'm going to do for you. Because we sit here and we think, right? We sit here and we think is that if we think in terms of what we're supposed to do for God. We may think we're supposed to do for God in here. Or we might have this grace thing going in here. But we still think, okay, with this grace, but I still got to do something for God. We think in terms of going to church, or we think of praying, or we think of giving in our offering plate, or sharing Jesus, or doing the other things, bringing shoes for souls. We think in all those things in here, and that's how we please God. And God's saying it's not have anything to do with that. This is about me. This is about God's love choosing Abraham. God's love coming to Abraham and saying, this is Abraham, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to do for you. And you stop and think about it, it's a pretty spectacular thing. Because God comes and God says, this is what I'm going to do. And he uses ordinary things to do it, right? Because we sit here and you think when God's going to do something, we think in terms of special effects, right? We think about what God's going to do in here. When God's going to do something in here, you think, right? You think earthquakes. Easter's coming, right? They had earthquakes. Or you think Jonah and the whale. That was pretty spectacular. Okay? Next week we're going to talk about Mount Sinai. And that was pretty spectacular. God coming to the top of Mount Sinai in here. We think about God doing spectacular things. We think of movie special effects in here. But this is not what that is. God's using something ordinary. Ordinary is making a contract, a covenant with Abraham to do something spectacular. It's that ordinary. When I lived in Oklahoma City, there was a guy by the name of Jeff. Went to the church I was at. And Jeff would have told you straight up, Jeff was just an ordinary guy. Just an ordinary guy from Oklahoma. You see, Jeff was a mechanic. Jeff was an auto mechanic. Auto and diesel mechanic. He'd been to schools, had the experience and stuff. Jeff could work on anything from a gasoline your lawnmower engine. Do you know those great big diesel engines that they drive the earth movers? He could tear either one of them apart and everything in between. That's what Jeff did for a living. And Jeff had all the tools. He had racks of tool cases in here that mechanics have and compressors and all this stuff in here in his garage. But see what Jeff did? Jeff would repair cars. Not for money. Jeff would find people at church or find people in the community that were widows down on their luck. Widows didn't have a whole lot of money. People who were down on their luck and just didn't have the money to afford a car repair in here. And Jeff would get their car over to his house. Sometimes he'd go. Most times he'd have them bring them over to his house. He'd bring it over to his house and he'd fix their cars for nothing. Half the time he paid for the parts out of his own pocket. And what he'd do is that he would draft guys to help him. Like me. A guy who similarly has no mechanical ability. He would draft guys to come in and just help him do this task in here. But it's in the process of doing this, Jeff was great at listening. Jeff was great at simply having a conversation. And you'd be up to your elbows in grease from an engine in here and sitting here talking. You realized one thing in here, that God loved Jeff and God loved you. He was great in the ordinary things of life, simply sharing God's love. Just living that love every day. Pastor John likes to describe it as whoever, wherever, and however. And whenever. Whoever you're with and wherever you're at and however it works in here. Just going out in here. See, it's not necessarily in the spectacular things. We think we have to be spectacular and be spectacular for God. But we don't have to be spectacular for God. What we have to do is we have to be ordinary for God. Just do that ordinary things of life and do it with Him. Do those ordinary things of life and do it in such a way that people see Jesus. Doing those ordinary things of life, that people see Jesus and see Jesus working in you, and that people look upon, like you did, Jeff, and you'd go, wow, isn't God good? Because in the process, Jeff would get forgotten. But people would walk away hearing and seeing and knowing about Jesus. Sometimes God uses the ordinary to do the spectacular things. I got to pause here a second. My throat this morning is scratchy, so I got to keep water in my throat. I apologize. This took place 4 years ago, actually. I can date it. This one was 4 years ago. 4 years ago, my father was celebrating his 80th birthday. And we decided, my cousins and my sister and I and my cousins and stuff, we were going to have a big party down at my parents' place down in Texas. To celebrate my dad's 80th birthday. We kind of planning with him and my mom and my sister and the cousins and stuff and making the arrangements. And so we had the party laid out for a particular weekend. Now, the same thing going on at that point in time. Our daughter Rachel was pregnant. Okay? I mean like any day pregnant. Okay? So Betty and I sat and we talked through and we decided that I obviously had to go to the birthday party. But Betty needed to stay in Cape in case Rachel went into labor so she could play mom, grandma, those kinds of things in delivery. So wheeled down through Branson and picked up my daughter Leah, and we went down to Texas and down here for his birthday over this one particular weekend, and we had a great weekend. Had cousins in, and we told stories, and we had friends in, and we listened to stories, and we had great food. We had a little bit to drink in here, and we laughed until our sides hurt. It was one of those high point weekends of life. And we left on Monday morning, and I wheeled back into Cape on Tuesday. With me in the time frame. Back in on Tuesday. And get back to the office on late Tuesday, and Wednesday morning I'm sitting in the office and my cell phone rings. And it's my brother-in-law calling from Texas. They'd taken my dad to the hospital, and he was not expected to live the day. On that Wednesday, we used a lot of cell phone minutes that day. And he ended up dying that night. And so after talking in here with Betty and talking with friends and more cell phone minutes, we decided that Betty needed to go to Texas with me for the funeral. And so we packed up, just got home on Tuesday. We turned around and we packed up and left Thursday after lunch. And we drove Thursday until we couldn't see straight anymore. And we stopped, I don't know, someplace in North Texas to spend the night. I have no clue where it was. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, the cell phone rings. It was my son-in-law that said Rachel was in labor. I don't remember whether she was at the hospital or she was on the way to the hospital. But the long and short of it was that she was in labor. A few hours later, we like to say, thank God for Steve Jobs. Because it was in the midst of cell phones, as we got all kinds of pictures and we got videos in here, and our granddaughter Lily was born. Went on down to Texas and we went to the funeral. And it was a good weekend. It wasn't as good as a previous weekend, but it was a good weekend. And we came home, we left Sunday and got into Springfield, directly to Springfield this time, directly to Springfield, and got into Springfield on Monday, and we went to the house where Rachel was. And this is like, remember, Lily's like 3 or 4 days old here, and got to the house in here, and after the hugs and welcomes and stuff, they bring this bundle of blankets to me. And they reach up and they hand this bundle of blankets to me and say, "This is your granddaughter." And I've got my granddaughter in my arms, and I look down, and this is the most beautiful, most adorable, most precious thing I've ever seen in my life. And I didn't want to let go. They actually accused me of holding her the whole, we were there for a couple of days. They actually accused me of me being the one who holds her the whole week. Let's hold 2 days, not letting anybody else hold her. But I didn't want to let go. You see, in baptism, when God in that water, and it's ordinary water. I may have said this before, the water we put in the baptismal font comes out of the tap in the sacristy. But in that ordinary water, God does something spectacular. He comes to you and takes his arms around you and holds you tenderly in his arms and says, "You're the most beautiful, adorable, and precious thing I've ever seen." And you're going to make a mess of your life. You're going to screw things up. And you're going to wiggle, and you're going to try to get out from my arms, but that's not matters. Because what it's about me, God's saying. Because I'm the one holding you. I'm the one loving you. I'm the one coming to you. It's about me. It's about my love. And my love coming to you. And he says, "You're the most adorable and the precious thing I've ever seen." And I hope right now that you can feel his arms around you. And holding you. Because he took you in his arms at your baptism, and he's not letting go. He's not going to let go of you. And listen to him say to you, "You're the most adorable, precious, beautiful thing I've ever seen." God uses the ordinary to do the spectacular. It was with Abraham. A simple thing, an ordinary covenant. And God does the spectacular. He does it with you. Ordinary water that he said before and he says again and says every day, I hope you hear his words as he's holding you in his arms. He says to you, "You're the most adorable, beautiful, and precious thing I've ever seen." Amen.